In 1994, Walter Smothers, Teresa Dion Harris, and Stacy Ramsey were all found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was based on the draconian felony murder rule, where if you're an unwilling accomplice and you just happen to be with someone, I don't even think accomplice is the right word, if you're with someone and they commit a murder, you're guilty of the murder. That's what happened to Teresa Dion Harris and Stacy Ramsey. Prior to the crime, Stacy Ramsey had no criminal history whatsoever. He was working 3 jobs at the age of 21. The actual killer, Walter Smothers, was given a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty. In exchange, he lied about Stacy and another co-defendant's involvement in the case. This came as no surprise since the actual killer's father-in-law at the time was the chief of police. And amazingly, Walter Smothers, the killer, was a policeman at least at the time in Huntingdon, Tennessee, named Walter Smothers. A different Walter Smothers, yet they claim that they aren't related. Now this is a small town. How many Walter Smothers have you known? It's hard to believe that they aren't related. The real killer, Walter Smothers, had a criminal history that included 2 full pages prior to this horrendous crime. He has even admitted that he considered killing Stacy and the other co-defendant as well, so that he would, quote, leave no witnesses, unquote. Stacy and the other co-defendant, Teresa Dion Harris, were denied the ability to testify for one another at each of their trials. That would have clearly cast doubt on Walter's version of the story, especially since he gave 4 conflicting statements to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. A videotaped statement taken prior to the trial with Walter, he admitted that Stacy had no real participation, was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and did not deserve the charges he was up against. The trial lawyers never used that in Stacy's defense during the trial. They didn't use the evidence at all. Stacy's case seems to me to be a perfect example of judicial and law enforcement corruption. A bad law, improper prosecution, and an improper job by the judge. Advocates against the felony murder rule have studied this and support Stacy Ramsey and are working to try to get the truth out about how lives are ruined by corrupt deals, plea bargains, corrupt prosecutors, inept or corrupt court-appointed attorneys. These are the people who are the real criminals in this case. Stacy Ramsey was arrested, charged, and convicted almost 20 years ago at the age of 21 for first-degree felony murder. There were 3 defendants: the actual killer, Walter S. Smothers, Teresa Dion Harris, and Stacy Ramsey. All 3 received life without parole, even though Teresa Dion Harris and Stacy Ramsey did not commit the murder, and that's without question. Stacy was the next-door neighbor to Teresa Dion Harris at the time, 1993. He didn't hang out with her, and he didn't even know Walter Smothers. Prior to the night of the murder, he only met him that night. He worked 3 jobs, 1 full-time and 2 part-time. He had no criminal history. Teresa and Walter Smothers had been partying all day, drinking and doing Valiums, as I understand it. That evening, Teresa Dion Harris sent her young son over to see if Stacy wanted to come over. He'd been working on his truck and told her son maybe. Almost 2 hours later, when he didn't go over, Teresa Dion Harris came over and convinced him to stop by. After showering, he went over about 8:30 and had a couple of beers. This is when he very first met Walter Smothers. An ex-boyfriend of Teresa's called the house and got into an argument with Walter at about 9 p.m. Walter then decided to go find the ex-boyfriend and fight him. The only problem was he had no vehicle and reverse gear was out in Teresa Dion Harris's car. Combined with the fact that they were both extremely drunk and high, they asked Stacy Ramsey if he would drive them over to find the ex-boyfriend. He reluctantly agreed. After driving around for over an hour without locating the ex, Stacy Ramsey's car broke down. He popped the hood and was under the hood, trying to see why the truck had quit, when he saw Walter out of the corner of his eye run past him. By that time, he looked over. He saw what was going on. Teresa had stopped a truck that was passing by. It was driven by a 19-year-old boy, and Walter had him at gunpoint, ordering out of his vehicle. Walter forced the victim into the bed of his own truck and ordered Stacy Ramsey to drive. Within less than 5 minutes, the gun accidentally went off, hitting the victim. 2 witnesses in a home nearby heard it. They heard the hollering and heard Walter tell Stacy Ramsey that if he moved the truck, he would blow his goddamn head off. The victim began screaming, and Walter told him that they were taking him to a hospital. After driving at a high rate of speed for approximately 6 miles, the victim again began screaming in pain. Walter then placed the shotgun under the victim's chin and pulled the trigger. He then said to Teresa Dion Harris and Stacy Ramsey, "I just blew his fucking brains out." Before the night was over, sick Walter Smothers mutilated the body and forced Stacy to help him, and when Stacy said he couldn't, he told him it was something he had to do. He told him they were all in it together, and that Stacy had no choice but to participate or he'd be next. Walter set the body on fire inside the victim's truck. Now, Walter Smothers got a plea bargain. This was no great surprise, since Walter's father-in-law was chief of police in the town, Thomas Goofy Brown, also the step-grandfather to Walter's 2-year-old son. Walter testified against both Teresa Dion Harris and Stacy Ramsey in 2 separate trials, quote, so he wouldn't fry, unquote. Although Teresa Dion Harris and Stacy Ramsey both gave the same statements, saying there was no talk of premeditation, it didn't matter. Walter Smothers gave 4 very different statements. They didn't matter either. He was a witness against the other 2, the only witness. Teresa Dion Harris was not allowed to testify in Stacy's defense at his trial, and he wasn't allowed to testify for her at her trial. This was on the advice of both attorneys. Now, Stacy Ramsey's court-appointed attorneys, a father and son team, Dee and Matthew Maddox, were not qualified to defend a capital case. They were defending a case against the death penalty. They're required to have a minimum of 5 years' experience in criminal cases. Co-counsel was only experienced in divorce, family law, bankruptcy, etc. No criminal experience, and had only been a licensed lawyer for 3 years. The attorneys met with Stacy Ramsey's family 2 weeks prior to his trial and told them they were hoping to work out a plea bargain with the DA to where Stacy Ramsey would plead guilty in exchange for life with parole after 25 years. And that's the best they could do because, quote, we still have to live and work in this town, unquote. During Stacy Ramsey's trial, they rarely objected to a single thing. The attorneys called no witnesses in his defense. Instead, they said, we're saving all of that for sentencing, in addition to withholding evidence that could make a huge difference at sentencing. The judge, Julian Quinn, vouched for a Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent's testimony. Physical evidence from Walter in the way of a videotape where he was interviewed by a private investigator hired by the defense was never used in the trial. Walter stated that Stacy Ramsey had nothing to do with the murder and that he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and didn't deserve a life sentence. The videotape mysteriously disappeared from the defense attorney's office, the DA's office, and was nowhere to be found. But Stacy's wife, Susan Ramsey, managed to locate it, and it's probably the only copy in existence. At the post-conviction hearing, the attorney, Ben Dempsey, another court-appointed attorney, told Stacy Ramsey they couldn't use the case because it was made after his trial, but in fact it was made 3 weeks before the trial. The defense in that case used not one single shred of evidence that the private investigator team had gathered. Not a single statement, not a thing. Every single interview they did, having gone all the way back to his high school coach, was nothing but positive comments and information concerning Stacy Ramsey. If that wasn't enough, in over a year's time, the post-conviction attorney, Ben Dempsey, couldn't locate Stacy Ramsey's records, blaming it on a tornado that hit the courthouse and the evidence having been destroyed. The judge gave a 90-day continuance, yet at the end of 90 days, Dempsey still hadn't located the records. But Susan Ramsey managed to locate all the missing records in 3 days, receiving the authorizations on a Friday and locating the records the following Monday. When Susan Ramsey began gathering all of her husband's legal records, she went to a pre-scheduled appointment at the trial lawyer's office right here in Huntingdon. Matthew Maddox. It was September 2010. Matthew Maddox not only refused Susan access to any and all records, but he threw her out of his office, then followed her outside and proceeded screaming at her at the top of his lungs across the morning traffic. Unprofessional, to say the least. When Susan filed a complaint with the Board of Professional Responsibility about the incident, they responded by saying there was nothing they could do about his conduct, and they failed to address the fact that he refused to release the legal files. One final corrupt note to this story: the Judicial Commissioner, A.J. Taylor, who signed the arrest warrants, was never officially sworn in. Therefore, it was an unlawful arrest. But the horrible story is the felony murder rule. The idea that you can be with someone who commits a murder and that makes you guilty. You're in essence prohibited from offering the normal kind of defense or getting the normal types of protections that someone would have. It's just an automatic. And this was a case botched from the word go. Stacy Ramsey and Teresa Dion Harris were at risk of being murdered by Walter Smothers unless they drove the truck. They couldn't run off in the woods. They were there. They had no choice. Walter Smothers had a gun. Stacy Ramsey and Teresa Dion Harris, in my opinion, should not be in prison for the rest of their life without the possibility of parole. They've already served 20 years. I think somebody needs to let them out.